November 5, 1940. 1,645 hours. The North Atlantic, roughly 700 miles east of Newfoundland. 37 merchant ships steam in loose convoy formation under a clear, cold sky. The kind of visibility that offers no mercy to anyone trying to hide. At their head, alone, sails a single escort, HMS Jervis Bay, a converted passenger liner armed with 7 single 6-inch guns, most of them manufactured before the last war ended, mounted on open-deck platforms with no shields, no fire control system worth the name, and no armor anywhere on her hull beyond the thickness of a peacetime cruise ship's plating. On the horizon, a shape appears that should not be there, confirmed within minutes as the German pocket battleship Admiral Scheer, 12,100 tons of welded steel, 6 11-inch guns capable of firing a 670-pound shell to 30,000 yards, and a fire control system built specifically to solve exactly this kind of long-range gunnery problem in daylight. Jervis Bay's captain, Edward Stephen Fogarty Fegen, has 2 choices, and only seconds to make either of them. He can turn his ship away and try to save her, in which case Scheer's guns, unmolested, will spend the next several hours working methodically through 37 fully loaded merchantmen carrying food, fuel, munitions, and raw materials Britain cannot survive without, or he can turn directly toward the most powerful warship for 1,000 miles in any direction, guns that outrange his by nearly double, and try to buy his convoy enough time and enough smoke to scatter into the coming dark. Fegen turns toward the enemy. 24 minutes later, Jervis Bay is a burning wreck beneath the Atlantic, and Fegen is dead. Of the convoy's 37 ships, 32 reach Britain. This is how an unarmed liner with guns older than most of her crew bought a convoy its life. The convoy Jervis Bay was escorting, designated HX-84, had sailed from Halifax, Nova Scotia. On October 28, 1940, one of the regular fast convoys carrying the raw materials of a war economy across an ocean, the German Navy was doing everything in its power to close. 37 ships, British, Canadian, and neutral registries mixed together, carried lumber, steel, grain, oil, and munitions. Cargo that represented not a single shipment, but a meaningful fraction of what Britain needed simply to keep fighting through the winter of 1940. By November, Britain stood entirely alone in Western Europe. France had fallen in June. The Battle of Britain had been won in the air that autumn, but the war at sea, the one that determined whether the population could be fed and the factories kept running, was still very much undecided, and German naval planners understood exactly where the country's vulnerability lay. U-boats operating from newly captured French Atlantic ports had already begun what German crews were calling the happy time, sinking Allied shipping faster than British and Canadian shipyards could replace it. Surface raiders added a second, less predictable threat entirely. Ships fast enough and powerful enough to strike an entire convoy in a single action, rather than picking off individual stragglers. And Germany had spent the interwar years building exactly the kind of vessel designed to do it. Admiral Scheer, the ship that found HX-84 that afternoon, belonged to the same Deutschland class as her sister ship, Admiral Graf Spee, the pocket battleship, whose destruction at the River Plate the previous December had already demonstrated both the class's power and its vulnerabilities. Built under the same Versailles Treaty loopholes that had produced Graf Spee, exploiting welded rather than riveted construction and lightweight alloys to pack battleship-caliber armament onto a treaty-limited hull. Scheer displaced roughly 12,100-ton standard and carried 6 11-inch guns and 2 triple turrets, backed by a secondary battery of 5.9-inch guns and a respectable anti-aircraft suite. Her 8-man diesel engines gave her a cruising range in excess of 19,000 nautical miles without refueling and a top speed of nearly 28 knots, fast enough to run down almost anything that could outfight her, and powerful enough to outfight almost anything. Fast enough to catch her, she had sailed from Germany on October 23, 1940, under Captain Zur, Sea Theater Crank, slipping through the Denmark Strait undetected on a mission of commerce raiding in the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean, precisely the kind of extended, independent raiding cruise. The loss of her sister ship 11 months earlier had done nothing to discourage German naval planners from attempting again. HX-84 was not a planned target. Scheer's radar and lookouts found the convoy by chance in the early afternoon of November 5. A British formation of considerable size, sailing without any air cover, and, as far as Crank's officers could initially tell, without any escort worth worrying about at all. The ship standing between Admiral Scheer and 37 merchantmen had never been designed to fight anyone. HMS Jervis Bay had been built in 1922 as a passenger liner for the Aberdeen and Commonwealth Line, running regular routes between Britain and Australia, carrying emigrants, mail, and cargo in a peacetime trade that had nothing whatsoever to do with naval warfare. She displaced roughly 14,000 tons. Considerably larger by hull volume than the warship she would eventually face, but built entirely to commercial standards. Thin plating designed to keep construction costs down and passenger capacity up, with no armor of any kind and no compartmentalization designed to survive battle damage. When the Admiralty requisitioned her in August 1939, in the final weeks before war broke out, she was one of dozens of large, fast merchant liners converted under a long-standing plan to supplement the regular cruiser fleet, a category the Navy called Armed Merchant Cruisers, or AMCs, ships that traded a warship's protection and fire control for a merchant liner's range, capacity, and, crucially, availability at a moment when Britain did not have nearly enough purpose-built cruisers to escort every convoy crossing every ocean the war now touched. Jervis Bay's conversion fitted her with 7 single 6-inch guns, most of them elderly weapons drawn from reserve stocks that had originally been manufactured for service in the First World War, mounted on open, unshielded platforms bolted to a hull that had never been engineered to absorb the recoil, let alone incoming fire. She had no radar, a rudimentary fire control system that amounted to little more than optical rangefinders and voice tube communication between guns, and a top speed, even at full peacetime power, of barely 15 knots, against Admiral Scheer's 28 knots. Her 11-inch guns, and a purpose-built fire control system, Jervis Bay was, by every measurable standard, not a warship capable of fighting a pocket battleship at all. She was a passenger liner wearing a warship's paint scheme, and everyone in the Admiralty who had approved her conversion understood the limitation perfectly well. AMCs were never meant to fight enemy capital ships. They were meant to patrol trade routes against unarmed or lightly armed raiders and, when the situation called for it, to be present. Because a convoy with even a token-armed escort was harder for an enemy captain to attack with complete confidence than a convoy with none at all, command of Jervis Bay had been given to Captain Edward Stephen Fogarty Fegen, a 49-year-old career Royal Navy officer from an Irish naval family, his father having also served as a captain in the Royal Navy before him. Fegen was, by the accounts of the men who served under him, an unremarkable, quietly competent officer of the kind the interwar Navy had produced in considerable numbers. Not a celebrated fighting captain with the reputation for aggression or daring. Simply a professional doing an unglamorous wartime job, escorting slow merchant convoys across an ocean that had already claimed a great many ships for better armed than his. His crew of roughly 254 officers and men was a mixture of regular Royal Navy sailors, Royal Naval Reserve officers drawn from the merchant service, and a substantial number of Royal Naval Volunteer Reserve ratings, men who in peacetime had been clerks, fishermen, and tradesmen rather than professional sailors, manning guns that in many cases were older than they were. If any of them had reason to expect that November 5, 1940, would be remembered as one of the defining actions of the naval war, nothing in Jervis Bay's record to that point suggested it. She had spent the preceding 14 months on unglamorous convoy escort duty in the Atlantic, precisely the kind of routine, largely uneventful work that made up the overwhelming majority of the naval war for most ships and most crews. Work that mattered enormously in aggregate and almost never produced a headline. Before we get into the engagement itself, if you're finding this deep dive into WW to History Trench interesting, subscribing takes a second and supports the channel. At approximately 1640 on November 5th, lookouts aboard several ships in the convoy, and shortly afterward, aboard Jervis Bay herself, spotted smoke on the horizon to the northeast, quickly resolving into the unmistakable silhouette of a large warship closing at speed. Fegen had almost no time to assess the situation properly. Admiral Scheer's superior speed and the clear, calm conditions meant that whatever ship this was would close the range within minutes, not hours. And there was no possibility of confirming her identity through anything other than direct visual observation at a distance that would already put Jervis Bay within range of serious gunfire. Within moments, the shape resolved clearly enough to remove any doubt. This was not a disguised merchant raider or an armed trawler. This was a German capital ship, and Fegen's convoy of 37 fully loaded merchantmen, several of them carrying munitions and fuel that would turn any hit into a catastrophic explosion, had almost no capacity to defend themselves or to outrun a ship making nearly twice their best speed. Fegen's decision, made in the span of perhaps 2 or 3 minutes, was the decision that would define the entire action. He ordered the convoy to scatter immediately in every direction and make smoke, breaking the tight formation that made an easy target into dozens of individual ships spreading out across miles of open ocean, each one considerably harder to find and to sink than a convoy sailing together. And he turned Jervis Bay directly toward Admiral Scheer, working up to her maximum speed of barely 15 knots. Closing the range as fast as her aging engines allowed, rather than attempting to flee, a maneuver that offered his ship no realistic prospect of survival and no realistic prospect of inflicting meaningful damage on an opponent whose guns outranged his own by nearly 2 to 1. What it offered instead was time. Every minute Admiral Scheer spent engaging Jervis Bay, a minute her guns were not spent hunting down individual scattering merchantmen, and every minute of daylight that burned away before Scheer finished the job a minute closer to a darkness that would make finding 37 scattered ships across an empty ocean vastly harder than sinking one confused convoy sailing in formation. Admiral Scheer opened fire at approximately 1,656 hours, at a range in the region of 17,000 yards, well beyond anything Jervis Bay's own guns could reach with any hope of a hit. The German gunnery, directed by a proper fire control system against a large, slow, poorly protected target, found the range with brutal efficiency. Early salvos straddled and then struck Jervis Bay's superstructure and bridge, and within the first several minutes of the engagement, Fegen himself was severely wounded, losing an arm to shell splinters, according to multiple accounts from survivors, and continued to direct the action from what remained of his bridge, rather than withdrawing for treatment, a decision that cost him his life, but kept his ship's bow pointed at the enemy for critical additional minutes. Jervis Bay's own guns returned fire throughout the action, closing the range as best her limited speed allowed in an attempt to bring her 6-inch weapons into some kind of effective engagement envelope. But at no point in the 24-minute action did she inflict damage remotely proportional to what she absorbed. Several accounts credit her gunners with straddling Scheer and possibly scoring minor hits, though German records do not confirm significant damage from the encounter. What mattered was not the exchange of fire in isolation, but its effect on the clock. Scheer's own guns, methodically and devastatingly accurate, reduced Jervis Bay turret by turret and compartment by compartment, setting her ablaze from bow to stern, destroying her bridge, her radio room, and eventually most of her remaining armament, while she continued, as long as she remained afloat and capable of movement, to close the range and keep herself between the German raider and the scattering convoy behind her. Fegen was killed by a further hit sometime before the ship went down, the exact moment lost to the confusion and destruction of the action's final minutes, and for this act, the deliberate decision to sacrifice his ship and his own life, in order to buy his convoy the time to scatter and survive. He was posthumously awarded the Victoria Cross, the citation specifically noting that his action, in the face of hopeless odds, gave the ships he was escorting their only chance of survival. Jervis Bay finally sank at approximately 1,720 hours, roughly 24 minutes after Admiral Scheer first opened fire, going down burning and shattered, with the great majority of her crew still aboard. Of her complement of roughly 254 officers and men, only around 65 survived. Most of them pulled from the freezing Atlantic water hours later by a Swedish merchant ship, the Storholm, whose captain, Sven Olander, made the deliberate decision to turn back into the darkness and the area of the action, against explicit instructions to keep scattering and flee, specifically to search for survivors. A decision that carried its own considerable risk, given that Admiral Scheer remained active in the immediate area and could easily have caught and sunk a lone rescue ship as readily as any other straggler. Sturholm's crew spent hours searching the debris-strewn water and darkness before finding and recovering survivors clinging to wreckage and lifeboats in conditions that had already claimed a significant number of men to exposure and drowning. In the time it took to locate them, Admiral Scheer, having sunk Jervis Bay, turned her attention to the scattering convoy, and here the true measure of Fegen's sacrifice became apparent. With daylight fading and the convoy's ships now spread across a wide area of ocean rather than concentrated in an easy formation, Crank's ship spent the following hours hunting individual targets rather than executing the kind of systematic, efficient destruction a compact, undefended convoy would have offered in full daylight. Scheer succeeded in sinking 5 additional ships from the convoy that evening and into the following hours, including the tanker San Demetrio, which was set ablaze and abandoned by her crew, believed lost with her cargo of aviation fuel. In one of the most remarkable postscripts of the entire action, a group of San Demetrio's own crew, having abandoned ship in a lifeboat, came across their apparently derelict, still burning tanker adrift. The following day reboarded her, fought the fires that were still raging through parts of the ship, restarted her engines, and sailed her, badly damaged but intact and still carrying the great majority of her valuable cargo, into the Clyde under her own power roughly a week later. A story that became a celebrated piece of merchant navy folklore in its own right, and was later made into a British feature film. Of the 37 ships that had sailed together as convoy HX-84, 32 ultimately reached British ports safely, their cargoes of food, fuel, and war material delivered largely intact. A survival rate that no one aboard Jervis Bay, or watching from the scattering convoy that afternoon, would have dared to predict as Admiral Scheer's first salvos found their range. The strategic consequences of the action extended well beyond the immediate fate of convoy HX-84. Crank, having spent a full evening and a considerable quantity of ammunition and fuel dealing with a single armed merchant cruiser, and then hunting down scattered stragglers in darkness, made the decision to break off further pursuit of the convoy's remaining ships and continue his raiding cruise southward toward calmer, less heavily patrolled waters, a decision shaped in no small part by uncertainty over whether British warships might now be converging on his reported position. Since Jervis Bay's wireless operators had succeeded in transmitting a radar warning before the ship's radio equipment was destroyed, alerting the Admiralty and every ship within range that a German capital ship was active in the area. That single transmission, sent in the opening minutes of an action Jervis Bay had no realistic hope of surviving, proved to be nearly as consequential as the delay her sacrifice brought directly, since it allowed British naval forces across the North Atlantic to redirect other convoys away from the area and put hunting groups on alert for a raider whose position had, for once, been pinpointed with some precision rather than guessed at across an empty ocean. Admiral Scheer went on to conduct a lengthy, and, from the German perspective, largely successful raiding cruise through the South Atlantic and Indian Ocean over the following months, eventually returning to Germany in April 1941, having sunk or captured over a dozen additional ships. But she never again encountered anything resembling the concentrated convoy target that HX-84 had briefly represented before Fegen's action broke it apart. And naval historians on both sides have generally credited the encounter with HX-84 as the single most consequential action of her entire war. The broader significance of what Jervis Bay accomplished lay less in the tactical details of a 24-minute gunnery duel she was never remotely equipped to win, and more, in what her action demonstrated about the actual function of an escort that everyone involved, from the Admiralty down to Fegen himself, understood could never fight the ships it might one day face. Armed merchant cruisers had been built and commissioned throughout the interwar years and the early months of the war, on the explicit understanding that they existed primarily as a deterrent and a delaying mechanism, rather than a genuine fighting force. Ships whose presence made an attacking captain's decision marginally harder and marginally slower, buying time for a convoy to scatter, for a wireless warning to be transmitted, for other, more capable forces to be alerted and to respond, rather than ships expected to defeat a purpose-built warship in open battle. Critics both before and after the war, examining the AMC program's cost in ships and lives against the handful of genuine successes it could point to, frequently characterized the entire concept as a wasteful half-measure. Converted liners sent to sea with obsolete guns and no armor against opponents that could, and eventually did destroy them with ease. A policy driven by desperate wartime shortages of proper escort vessels rather than sound naval doctrine. Jervis Bay's loss, and the loss of her sister conversions Rawalpindi, sunk in almost identical circumstances by Scharnhorst and Gneisenau the previous November, and several others destroyed in equally one-sided actions across the war's early years, gave that criticism considerable weight. But the outcome of HX-84 offered a harder, more specific answer to the question of what these ships were actually for. Jervis Bay did not need to damage Admiral Scheer meaningfully, did not need to survive the engagement, and did not need to sink a single enemy ship in order to succeed in the only mission that mattered that afternoon. She needed only to buy time, to draw fire away from 37 merchant ships, and onto herself for as long as she could physically remain afloat and capable of steaming toward the enemy. And by that measure, the only measure that actually applied to her category of ship, she succeeded completely. 32 ships and their cargoes, and the thousands of tons of food, fuel, and war material they represented at a moment when Britain could not spare any of it, reached port because a captain and a crew aboard an unarmed converted liner chose to turn toward a battleship rather than away from it, understanding with total clarity that the decision would almost certainly kill every one of them. Fegen's Victoria Cross citation, published in the London Gazette in the weeks following the action, made the calculation explicit in language stripped of any embellishment that his heroic action in taking his ship, armed with only 6-inch guns, into close action with a formidable enemy ship armed with 11-inch guns, in order to give the ships of the convoy time to scatter and escape, was in keeping with the highest traditions of the Royal Navy. It was a citation written not for a tactical victory in any conventional sense, since Jervis Bay inflicted no confirmed serious damage on her opponent, and was herself entirely destroyed within half an hour, but for an act whose value lay purely in what it enabled elsewhere. In convoys that reached port and ships that survived precisely because one captain understood that his ship's only genuine weapon, in a fight her guns could never win, was time itself. The Admiralty's own post-war assessment of armed merchant cruiser operations, drawing heavily on the HX-80 for action as its central example, concluded that the category's real operational value had never resided in its ability to fight and win, a standard by which the entire program would have to be judged a failure, but in its capacity to force an enemy raider to choose between disengaging entirely, at the cost of losing contact with the target it had already found, or engaging an escort and losing the greater part of the convoy she was protecting to scattering and darkness in the process. Every AMC captain who took his ship to sea understood, at some level, that he was commanding a delaying action waiting to happen, rather than a warship capable of genuine combat, and the men who crewed these liners, reservists and volunteers manning guns built for an earlier war on hulls built for peacetime commerce, understood the same thing about their own role within it. Jervis Bay's wreck lies today on the floor of the North Atlantic, in water far too deep for any practical recovery or memorial dive, roughly 700 miles from the nearest landfall, in the same stretch of ocean where 37 merchant ships once sailed together toward a threat none of them could have outrun or outfought alone. A memorial to her and her crew stands today in Hermanville-sur-Mer, and her name, along with Fegen's, is remembered annually by the Merchant Navy Association and by veterans organizations connected to the ships she once escorted, a recognition that has as much to do with what an unarmed liner proved about the actual mechanics of convoy protection as with the specific tactical details of a single lopsided battle, the pocket battleship that destroyed her, by every specification that mattered. Faster, better armed, better protected, and equipped with a fire control system built for exactly this kind of engagement, never faced any realistic prospect of losing the 24-minute action itself. What she lost, without ever fully realizing it in the moment, was the initiative that had made HX-80 for look from the bridge of Admiral Scheer at 1,640 hours that afternoon, like an easy and complete victory waiting to be collected. A converted passenger liner with guns older than half her crew, no armor, and no realistic hope of surviving the engagement she deliberately provoked, took that initiative away in the span of 24 minutes, not through firepower she never possessed, but through the simple, deliberate decision to turn toward the enemy instead of away from him, and to keep steaming in that direction for as long as her burning, shattered hull remained capable of movement. 32 ships reached Britain because of that decision. The most dangerous raider in the German surface fleet broke off her attack and never fully recovered the tactical position she had held in the opening minutes of that afternoon. And a ship that had been built to carry passengers and mail between Britain and Australia, converted to a warship only because the Royal Navy in 1939 did not have enough real warships to go around, proved in her final 24 minutes that the value of a ship in battle is not always measured by what she can destroy, but sometimes, and perhaps most enduringly, by what she is willing to absorb so that something else can survive.